The blood had come in the night, and with it, every dream Florence Whitmore had tried to hold onto slipped away like water through her fingers. She lay in the narrow bed in her mother-in-law's house outside Galesburg, Illinois, clutching her stomach as the cramping finally subsided into a dull, empty ache that seemed to hollow her out from the inside. The baby was gone. 3 months of secret joy, of whispered plans with her husband Thomas before he died in that threshing accident. All of it reduced to nothing but grief, and the crimson stain on her nightgown that wouldn't wash clean no matter how hard she scrubbed. Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway at dawn, her face carved from stone, arms crossed over her chest. "You lost it then," she said, not a question but an accusation. "Lost the only thing that made you worth keeping under this roof." Florence looked up from where she sat on the floor beside the wash basin, her hands raw and trembling. "Mrs. Whitmore, please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to what? Lose my son's child. The only piece of Thomas I had left." Margaret's voice cracked, but there was no softness in it, only rage looking for a target. "You've been nothing but trouble since the day he married you. Pretty face, empty promises. Now you can't even do the one thing a woman is supposed to do, please." Florence could barely form the words. Her body ached, her heart ached worse. "I need time. Just a few days to recover, and then I'll work harder. I'll earn my keep, I swear it. You'll do no such thing. I want you out of my house by noon." Margaret turned on her heel, her skirts swishing with finality. "Take what's yours and nothing else. You're no family of mine anymore." Florence sat there on the cold floor long after her mother-in-law's footsteps faded down the hallway. The October morning light filtered through the thin curtains, illuminating the small room that had been her prison and her sanctuary these past 4 months since Thomas died. She had nowhere to go. Her own parents were dead, her only sister married off to a merchant in St. Louis. She had exactly $11 to her name and a carpet bag with 2 dresses, a shawl, and her mother's Bible. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Florence stood at the end of the dirt road leading away from the Whitmore farm, her carpet bag pulling at her shoulder, her body weak from loss and grief. The Illinois prairie stretched out before her, endless and indifferent. She started walking toward town, each step an effort of will, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She made it perhaps 2 miles before her legs gave out. The world tilted sideways, and she found herself on her knees in the tall grass beside the road, retching up the nothing she'd eaten that morning. The sun beat down despite the autumn chill in the air, and she realized distantly that she was probably going to die here. Maybe that would be easier. Maybe that would hurt less than the gaping wound where her future used to be. The sound of hoofbeats registered somewhere in her consciousness, but she couldn't summon the energy to lift her head. The horse stopped nearby. Boots hit the ground. "Madam," the voice was male, deep, concerned. "Madam, are you hurt?" A hand touched her shoulder gently, and Florence flinched. She looked up into a face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see dark eyes studying her with genuine worry. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and the rough clothing of a working cowboy. He couldn't have been more than 25, maybe 26. "I'm fine," Florence managed, though clearly she was anything but. "Just resting. Resting or dying." His tone was blunt but not unkind. "Because from where I'm standing, you look about ready to keel over for good." He glanced down the road toward the Whitmore place, then back at her. "You coming from the Whitmore farm?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Heard Thomas died." Terrible thing, that accident. He crouched down so they were eye level. "I'm Ethan Parker. I work the cattle ranch about 5 miles west of here. Where are you headed?" "I don't know." The admission cost her what little pride she had left. "I don't have anywhere to go. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Margaret throw you out." Florence's silence was answer enough. He muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse, then stood and offered her his hand. "Come on. You're in no shape to be walking anywhere. My place isn't much, but it's got a roof and a bed, and you're welcome to it while you figure things out." "I couldn't possibly. You got a better option." He kept his hand extended, patient. "Because like I said, you look about ready to die right here in the grass, and I'd rather not have that on my conscience." Florence stared at his hand for a long moment. Every rule of propriety she'd ever learned screamed that accepting help from a strange man was madness. But propriety had never left her bleeding and homeless on the side of a road. She took his hand. Ethan pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness, steadying her when she swayed. He retrieved her carpet bag and helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. Florence was too exhausted to feel embarrassed about the intimacy of the arrangement, the way his arms came around her to hold the reins. She let herself slump against his solid warmth and closed her eyes. The ride to Ethan's ranch passed in a haze. She had impressions of open land, a small creek, the lowing of cattle in the distance. When they finally stopped, she opened her eyes to see a modest cabin set against a backdrop of cottonwood trees, with a barn and a few outbuildings nearby. It wasn't grand, but it was well maintained, and there was something peaceful about it that made her chest ache with longing. Ethan dismounted and lifted her down as if she weighed nothing. "Can you walk?" "I think so." But when her feet touched the ground, her knees buckled again. This time he caught her and simply picked her up, carrying her toward the cabin. "Stubborn," he said, but there was something almost like amusement in his voice. "That might serve you well out here." He pushed open the door with his boot and carried her inside to a small room with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt. The cabin was simple but clean, with a potbelly stove in the main room and shelves lined with books. He set her down on the bed carefully. "When's the last time you ate?" Florence had to think about it. "Yesterday morning, I think." He shook his head. "Stay put. I'll make you something." She wanted to protest that he'd already done too much, that she shouldn't accept more kindness from a stranger, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she lay back on the bed and stared at the rough wooden ceiling, wondering how her life had become so thoroughly unmoored in the space of a single night. True to his word, Ethan returned within the hour with a tray bearing bread, butter, cold chicken, and weak tea. He set it on the small table beside the bed and pulled up a chair. "Eat slow. Don't want you getting sick again." Florence pushed herself upright and took a tentative bite of bread. It was good, fresh-baked, probably from someone in town. She ate mechanically, forcing down food she didn't want because she knew she needed it. Ethan sat in silence, not watching her directly but present, steady. When she finished what she could, he took the tray and said, "You should rest now. We can talk later when you're stronger." "Why are you helping me?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." Ethan paused in the doorway, his back to her. "My mother died when I was 14, childbirth complications. My father blamed my baby sister, said she wasn't worth the cost. Threw her out when she was barely 16, pregnant and alone." He turned to face her, and his eyes were dark with old pain. "I never saw her again. Found out 3 years later she died in a St. Louis tenement, her and the baby both." He held Florence's gaze. "So when I see a woman alone on the road, looking like death, I don't ride past. That's why." He left before she could respond, closing the door softly behind him. Florence lay back down, pulling the quilt up to her chin, and for the first time since the bleeding started, she let herself cry. Great, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body, mourning Thomas and the baby and the life she'd thought she'd have. She cried until she had nothing left, and then she slept. The next few days passed in a blur of sleeping and waking. Ethan brought her meals 3 times a day, simple fare but well prepared. He never asked questions, never pressed her to talk. He just provided what she needed and then left her alone to grieve. Sometimes she heard him moving around the cabin, the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the crackling of the fire in the stove. Once she woke in the night and heard him playing a harmonica on the front porch, a slow, mournful tune that seemed to understand everything she couldn't say. On the 4th day, Florence woke feeling stronger. The physical pain had faded to a manageable ache, though the grief sat heavy as a stone in her chest. She got out of bed for the first time under her own power and made her way to the main room of the cabin. Ethan looked up from where he sat at the table, mending a saddle strap. "You're up. I've imposed on your kindness long enough." Florence smoothed down her dress, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. "I should start earning my keep. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need." "You don't need to do anything yet. You're still recovering." "I need to do something." Her voice came out fiercer than she intended. "I can't just lie in that bed forever thinking about everything I lost. Please." Understanding flickered across his face. He set down the saddle strap. "All right. There's coffee on the stove if you want some. And if you're feeling up to it, I wouldn't say no to having those shirts in the basket mended. Been meaning to get to them for weeks." It felt good to have a task, something to occupy her hands and mind. Florence settled into the chair across from him and picked up the first shirt, examining the torn seam. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the occasional lowing of cattle outside. "How long have you had this ranch?" she asked finally. "About 3 years. Saved up working trail drives after my father passed. It's not much, but it's mine." He glanced around the cabin with something like pride. "Built most of it myself. It's nice, peaceful. Gets lonely sometimes, but yeah, it's peaceful." He paused, then added carefully, "You can stay as long as you need to, I mean that." Florence looked up from her mending. "People will talk. An unmarried woman living with an unmarried man. Let them talk. Most folks in Galesburg know me well enough. And the ones who judge you for being thrown out by Margaret Whitmore when you just lost a baby. Well, their opinions aren't worth much anyway." The matter-of-fact way he said it, acknowledging what had happened without demanding details, made something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "You're a kind man, Ethan Parker. Just trying to do right." He returned his attention to the saddle strap, but she saw the faint color rise in his cheeks. As the days turned into weeks, Florence found herself settling into a routine. She took over the cooking and cleaning, tended the small vegetable garden behind the cabin, mended clothes and patched the curtains that had worn thin. Ethan worked the ranch from sunup to sundown, riding out to check on his cattle, mending fences, hauling hay. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and talk, tentative at first, then with increasing ease. She learned that he'd grown up on a farm outside Chicago, that he'd lost his mother and sister and father all before he turned 21. That he'd drifted west working various jobs until he'd saved enough to buy this land. That he loved the open spaces of Illinois, the way you could see storms coming from miles away, the sound of meadowlarks in the spring. He learned in return that she'd met Thomas at a church social, that their courtship had been brief and their marriage briefer. That she'd loved him but hadn't known him well, not really. That she'd wanted children more than anything, had spent hours dreaming about the baby she'd lost before she even had the chance to feel it move. "You think it was my fault?" she asked one night in late October, the question that had been haunting her. "Did I do something wrong?" Ethan looked up from the book he'd been reading. "No, these things happen sometimes. It's nobody's fault." Margaret said, Margaret is a bitter woman who lost her son and needed someone to blame. Don't let her poison get into your head." His voice was firm. "You didn't do anything wrong, Florence." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about hearing it in his deep voice made her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered. November arrived with frost on the windows and the first real cold snap. Ethan brought in extra wood, and Florence made hearty stews that filled the cabin with warmth. She found herself watching him more than she should, noticing the way he moved with quiet efficiency, the gentleness in his calloused hands when he treated a cow with an injured leg, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. She told herself it was just gratitude. He'd saved her life, given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go. Of course, she felt drawn to him. It didn't mean anything more than that. But then came the night when a winter storm rolled in unexpectedly, temperatures dropping fast and wind howling around the cabin. Ethan came in from securing the barn looking half frozen, his coat dusted with snow. Without thinking, Florence rushed to help him out of his wet things, hanging them by the fire and bringing him hot coffee with shaking hands. "You're going to catch your death," she scolded, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "I'm fine." But his teeth were chattering, and when she pressed her hand to his forehead, he was ice cold. "You're not fine. Sit closer to the fire." She pulled his chair nearer to the stove and started heating water for a warm bath. "When's the last time you had a decent meal? You work yourself too hard," says the woman who cleans this whole cabin top to bottom every other day. But he was smiling slightly, leaning into the warmth of the fire. "You worry too much. Someone has to worry about you." The words came out more tender than she intended, and she felt her face heat. "I mean, you've been so kind to me. It's only fair that I look after you too. Florence." His voice made her turn from the stove. His dark eyes were serious, searching. "I don't do this because I expect anything in return. You know that, right?" "I know, but I want to. You've become—" She struggled for the right word. "Important to me." The air between them felt suddenly charged, weighted with everything unsaid. Ethan stood, the blanket falling from his shoulders, and took a step toward her, then another. He stopped just within reach, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "You've become important to me too," he said quietly. "More than you probably should have. Ethan." His name was barely a whisper. He raised his hand as if to touch her face, then stopped himself. "It's too soon. You're still grieving. I shouldn't, please." She didn't know what she was asking for, only that she needed him to close the distance between them. Needed something to make her feel alive again instead of like a ghost haunting her own life. He cupped her cheek with his palm, so gentle it made her want to cry. "I don't want to take advantage. You've been through too much." "You're not taking advantage. I'm here because I want to be." She covered his hand with hers, holding it against her face. "I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again after losing the baby after Thomas. But you've made me feel like maybe I could have a future after all. Maybe I could be happy again." "You can," he said fiercely. "You will be. You deserve that, Florence. You deserve everything good." She stretched up on her toes and kissed him, soft and tentative. For a heartbeat he went still, and she thought she'd made a terrible mistake. Then his arms came around her and he was kissing her back, deep and sure, like she was something precious he'd been waiting his whole life to find. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling for you," he admitted. "I tried not to, but I am." "I'm falling for you too." The truth of it blazed through her, bright and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "I know it hasn't been long and maybe I'm crazy, but you're not crazy." He kissed her again, softer this time. "We'll take it slow. No rush, we've got time." But time in the Illinois winter felt different, stretched and compressed all at once. The days were short and the nights long, and they spent most of their time together in the warm cabin, cooking and reading and talking about everything and nothing. Florence felt herself coming back to life bit by bit, like a flower unfurling after a long frost. December brought heavy snow and bitter cold. Ethan taught her to ride his spare horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, and they rode out together to check on the cattle huddled in the shelter of the windbreaks he'd built. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, the constant vigilance required to keep animals alive through the harsh season. One evening as they rode back toward the cabin through falling snow, Ethan reached over and took her hand. They rode like that, gloved fingers intertwined, until they reached the barn. Inside, out of the wind, he helped her dismount and pulled her close. "I love you," he said, the words simple and sure. "I know I probably shouldn't say it yet, but I do. I love you, Florence." Joy burst through her chest like sunlight. "I love you too, God help me, I do." They kissed in the dim barn with snow swirling outside and the horses shuffling in their stalls, and Florence felt like she'd finally found her way home. Christmas came and Ethan surprised her with small gifts he'd bought in town. A warm shawl, a set of hair combs, a book of poetry. She'd knitted him a scarf and new gloves and made his favorite apple pie. They spent the day in comfortable domesticity, and that night as they sat by the fire, he said, "Marry me." Florence looked up from her knitting, certain she'd misheard. "What? Marry me?" He set down his book and turned to face her fully. "I know it's soon, and if you need more time, I'll wait. But I love you, and I want you to stay here not as a guest, but as my wife. I want to build a life with you, Florence, if you'll have me." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes, God, yes, Ethan, I'll marry you." He kissed her long and deep, his hands tangled in her hair, and when they finally drew apart he was grinning like a boy. "We'll go into town tomorrow and talk to Reverend Miller. We can get married as soon as you want. The sooner the better." She laughed, dizzy with happiness. "I don't want to wait any more." They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Galesburg with a handful of Ethan's friends as witnesses. Florence wore her best dress and carried a small bouquet of dried flowers, and when Ethan said his vows, his voice was steady and sure. She felt the weight of the gold band he slipped onto her finger and knew that this time, this marriage would be different. This time she was choosing someone who saw her, valued her, loved her for who she was and not just what she represented. The ride back to the ranch, to their home, felt like flying. Inside the warm cabin, Ethan built up the fire while Florence changed into her nightgown, nervous and excited all at once. When he came into the bedroom, he paused in the doorway, taking her in with such reverence that she felt beautiful despite everything. "Are you sure?" he asked. "We can wait if you need to." "I'm sure." She held out her hand. "I want this. I want you." He came to her then, and they came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies and hearts in the darkness. Afterward, as she lay in his arms listening to his heartbeat, Florence felt peace settle over her like a benediction. She'd lost so much, grieved so deeply, but somehow she'd found her way here to this man who loved her, and that felt like a kind of miracle. Winter deepened into January and February, the coldest months, but the cabin was always warm and full of love. They talked late into the nights about their dreams for the ranch, for their future. Ethan wanted to expand his herd, maybe get some horses to breed and sell. Florence wanted a bigger garden come spring, and maybe chickens. They both wanted children, though they agreed to wait until she felt ready, until enough time had passed that a new pregnancy wouldn't be shadowed by the loss of the first. One afternoon in March, when the first thaw was starting and mud made the roads nearly impassable, there was a knock at the door. Ethan opened it to reveal Margaret Whitmore standing on the porch, looking older and harder than Florence remembered. "I need to speak with Florence," Margaret said, her voice cold. Florence came to stand beside Ethan, his hand immediately finding hers in support. "What do you want, Mrs. Whitmore? I heard you got married." To him. Margaret's lip curled as she looked at Ethan. "Didn't take you long, did it? Thomas barely cold in his grave. Thomas has been dead nearly 6 months." Florence kept her voice level though anger simmered beneath. "And you're the one who threw me out when I needed help most. You have no right to judge what I do now. That baby was my grandchild. That baby was mine." Florence's voice broke, but she pushed on. "I loved that child. I grieved that loss. And you made it so much worse by blaming me for something I couldn't control. So no, I don't want to hear anything you have to say about Thomas or the baby or my marriage. You gave up any claim to me when you put me out on the road to die." Margaret's face went red, then white. "I came to offer you money for your trouble, for the loss. I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you." Florence squeezed Ethan's hand. "I have everything I need right here." "You'll regret this," Margaret spat. "Mark my words. The only thing I regret is that I didn't leave your house on my own terms instead of waiting for you to throw me out." Florence straightened her spine. "Goodbye, Mrs. Whitmore. Don't come back." Ethan closed the door in the older woman's face, and they heard her muttering angrily as she retreated to her wagon. Florence was shaking, adrenaline coursing through her, but also feeling lighter than she had in months. "You all right?" Ethan pulled her into his arms. "I am. For the first time, I really am." She looked up at him. "Thank you for standing with me." "Always," he promised. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Spring arrived properly in April, bringing with it new grass and wildflowers and the sound of birdsong. Florence planted her garden while Ethan worked on expanding the barn. They fell into an easy partnership, supporting each other through the long days of work, finding joy in the simple rhythm of their life together. In May, Florence realized her monthly courses were late. She waited a few more weeks to be sure, afraid to hope, but when she finally told Ethan, his face lit up with such pure happiness that she knew this time would be different. This time she had someone who loved her unconditionally, who would support her no matter what happened. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. Ethan was attentive without being overbearing, making sure she didn't work too hard, rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings. They talked about names and made plans for converting the storage room into a nursery. There were moments when fear crept in, when Florence remembered the blood and the loss, but Ethan was always there to hold her through the panic, to remind her that this was a different pregnancy, a different time. That whatever happened, they would face it together. In December, almost exactly a year after Ethan had proposed, Florence went into labor. The midwife from town came and settled in to help, and Ethan held Florence's hand through every contraction, never leaving her side even when the labor stretched on for hours. Finally, as the winter sun set outside the window, their son was born. He came into the world squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect. The midwife cleaned him up and placed him in Florence's arms, and she looked down at the tiny miracle with wonder. "He's here," she breathed. "He's really here." Ethan was crying, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and son. "He's beautiful. You're beautiful. Thank you, God, Florence, thank you." They named him Thomas after the husband and father who had died too soon, but also giving him Ethan's middle name of James. Thomas James Parker. A bridge between past and future, between grief and joy. The first weeks were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and endless feedings, but also suffused with a happiness Florence had never imagined possible. Ethan was a devoted father, taking his turn walking the floor with Thomas when he cried, changing diapers without complaint, singing soft lullabies in his deep voice that always seemed to soothe the baby. As winter gave way to spring, and then summer, their family found its rhythm. Florence healed from the birth, grew strong again. Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a chubby baby with Ethan's dark eyes and her own fair hair. The ranch prospered, Ethan's herd growing, his reputation as a fair dealer spreading through the county. One warm evening in late June, they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Thomas dozed in Florence's arms. Ethan had his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his solid warmth, feeling utterly content. "You ever think about how we met?" she asked quietly. "How different things could have been if you'd ridden past that day. I think about it sometimes." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But I didn't ride past. I found you and you let me help you, and somehow we found our way here. I was so broken then. I thought I'd never be whole again." "You were never broken, just hurt, grieving. There's a difference." He looked down at her, his eyes soft. "And even if you had been broken, I would have loved you anyway. I would have loved you through it until you could see yourself the way I see you." "How do you see me?" "Strong, brave, beautiful, kind," he smiled. "Stubborn as hell when you want to be, the best mother, the best wife, my whole heart." She kissed him soft and lingering, then pulled back to look at their son sleeping peacefully between them. "I want more of these," she said. "More children, more years, more of this life we're building together. Then that's what we'll have." Ethan's voice was a promise. "As many as you want, as long as we're together." The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings. There were hard winters and drought summers, cattle lost to disease and crops that failed. But there were also more children. A daughter they named Caroline, then another son, Benjamin, and finally twin girls, Emma and Alina. The cabin was expanded into a proper house, with enough bedrooms for everyone and a wide porch where they spent long summer evenings. Florence's garden grew to provide vegetables for their family and enough extra to sell in town. Ethan's ranch became one of the most successful in the county. They hired hands to help with the work, built a larger barn and a chicken coop and a smokehouse. Their children grew up strong and happy, learning to ride and work the land, going to school in Galesburg and coming home with stories and questions. Sometimes Florence would catch sight of Margaret Whitmore in town, older now and stooped, always alone. She felt pity more than anger, knowing the older woman had chosen bitterness over forgiveness and had lost so much because of it. But Florence had learned to let go of that pain, to focus on the life she'd built rather than the one she'd lost. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised her with a trip to Chicago, just the two of them while his parents stayed with the children. They stayed in a hotel and went to a theater and ate at restaurants, playing at being young and carefree. But what Florence loved most was simply walking through the city streets hand in hand with her husband, knowing they'd built something real and lasting together. "You ever regret it?" she asked him one evening as they sat in their hotel room watching the city lights. "Taking in a grieving widow on the side of the road, you could have had an easier life." Ethan pulled her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her. "Not for one single second. You and our children are the best things that ever happened to me. I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over. Even knowing how stubborn I can be, how I rearrange your tools and insist on ridiculous things like curtains in the barn," he laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Especially knowing all that. You make life interesting, Florence Parker. You make it worth living." They made love that night with the tenderness of long practice and the passion that had never quite faded, and Florence thought about how far she'd come from that broken woman on the road. How grief had nearly destroyed her, but how love had rebuilt her into someone stronger, More years passed, bringing grandchildren and gray hair and the sweet ache of time's passage. They watched their children grow and marry and start families of their own. Thomas James became a doctor in Galesburg, dedicating his life to helping others. Caroline married a teacher and moved to Springfield. Benjamin took over the ranch, working side by side with his aging father. The twins both married brothers from a neighboring farm and stayed close by. Florence and Ethan grew old together, their bodies slowing but their love never dimming. They spent their days on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, telling stories about the old days, holding hands like they were still young lovers. On a warm spring evening when Florence was 62 and Ethan 65, they sat in their usual spot watching the sunset. The light turned everything golden, and Florence thought about that October day so many years ago when Ethan had found her on the road and changed the trajectory of her entire life. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Ethan's voice was still deep despite his years, still capable of making her heart skip. "For seeing me when I was invisible, for letting me grieve, for loving me back to life." She squeezed his weathered hand. "For giving me this beautiful life, these beautiful children. For every single day of the past 40 years. It's been my honor," he said simply. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Illinois sky in shades of pink and purple and gold. Around them, the ranch buzzed with life. Grandchildren laughing, cattle lowing in the distance, the creek babbling over stones. Everything they'd built together, everything they'd created from grief and kindness and stubborn hope. Florence leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She thought about the girl she'd been, devastated and alone, certain her life was over. She thought about the man who'd stopped when he could have ridden past, who'd offered shelter without expectation, who'd loved her through the darkness until she could find light again. She thought about how sometimes the worst moments of your life could lead you to the best ones, if you were brave enough to keep going. How love could heal wounds you thought were fatal. How family wasn't always blood, but sometimes choice and commitment and showing up every single day. Their son Benjamin came out onto the porch with his wife and their newest baby, a little girl they'd named Florence after her grandmother. "Want to hold her, Mama?" he asked. Florence opened her arms and took the warm weight of her namesake, looking down at the tiny face with its perfect features. The baby gazed up at her with solemn eyes, and Florence felt the circle complete itself. All the loss and pain and grief had led her here to this moment, surrounded by love and family and hope for the future. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to this beautiful, complicated world. You're going to love it here." Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and together they looked at the newest member of their family, this continuation of their story. The evening breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. Florence closed her eyes and breathed it all in, grateful for every moment, every choice, every piece of grace that had brought her here. She'd been lost once, broken and bleeding on the side of a road with nothing left to live for. But a good man had stopped and offered kindness, had given her space to grieve and time to heal, had loved her into wholeness again. And together, they'd built this life, this family, this legacy of love that would extend far beyond their own years. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself all those years ago, but it was so much better than anything she could have dreamed. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Florence handed the baby back to Benjamin and settled against her husband's shoulder. They rocked gently in their chairs, hands intertwined, hearts beating in the same steady rhythm they'd found 40 years before. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they'd been the first time she'd spoken them in that snowy barn. "I love you too," Ethan replied, pressing a kiss to her silver hair. "Always have, always will." And there on the porch of the home they'd built together, surrounded by the family they'd created and the life they'd fought for, Florence Parker felt completely, perfectly at peace. The grief was still there, a scar she'd carry forever, but it no longer defined her. Instead, she was defined by love, by resilience, by the choice to keep living even when living hurt. She was defined by the man beside her who'd seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. By the children and grandchildren who called this place home. By the garden that bloomed every spring and the cattle that grazed in summer fields and the creek that sang its endless song. She was defined by hope renewed, by second chances, by the grace of being found when you thought you were lost forever. And as the night settled around them gentle and warm, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they always had. The story of Florence and Ethan wasn't about perfection or fairy tale endings. It was about real love, the kind that shows up in the hard times and stays through the grief. The kind that builds slowly, day by day, choice by choice, into something unshakable. The kind that takes a broken heart and teaches it to beat again. And that, Florence thought as sleep began to pull at her, was the best kind of love story there was.